This scene from Dune Part 2 is truly impressive. 3 gigantic sandworms emerge from the smoke and crash into the ground with immense force. I decided to recreate this moment in Blender, fully aware that the simulations would be a serious challenge. I started by modeling the sandworms. At that stage I wasn't thinking about the simulations yet. I just focused on making the model look as realistic and detailed as possible. Later on I added finer details using procedural textures. This is the finished sandworm model with procedural textures. To animate the sandworms I used the curve modifier. It gave me movement that felt similar to the original scene. I also created the ground and added a custom texture to it. Then I duplicated the worm model to add the other two. The next challenge was simulating how the ground deforms. In theory, I should have used a complex physics simulation, but that would have taken a lot of time and patience. So I went for a simpler method. I used the warp modifier on the ground. First I added a subdivision surface modifier, then placed 2 empties above the surface, which gave me control over how the ground would deform. To make it look more natural I added procedural textures to the modifier. After repeating and tweaking this setup I finally got a result I was happy with. Thanks to this method I had a really solid foundation for building the smoke simulations. Here is a look at all the modifiers used just for the ground. Before getting into the simulations I added the camera. Luckily the shot doesn't involve any complicated camera movement. The most important part was adding some subtle shake to make it feel more cinematic. Here is a simple way to do that. And finally it was time for the simulations. I knew it wouldn't be easy because this scene needed a lot of smoke. To show the creation process, I'll start by quickly explaining how simulations work in Blender. Simulations are made of 3 types of objects. The domain is the space where the simulation is calculated. The flow object emits smoke, fire, or liquid. And finally, the effector can influence the simulation if needed. Here's a quick look at how to add each of these objects in Blender. My general plan was to create all simulations in separate Blender files, and then import them into one final scene using OpenVDB files. Doing all the simulations in a single file could have been much harder, and I would have had less control over individual elements. I started by simulating how the ground reacts as the sandworms move across it. I used a plane as the flow object, and added a subdivision surface modifier and a shrink wrap modifier. These helped the object match the shape of the terrain, and made the smoke movement feel more chaotic. The plane follows the location of empty objects that deform the ground. This is how the domain and simulation settings looked. By using keyframes, I controlled when the flow object should emit smoke. The most important settings were resolution, divisions, and vorticity. In the end, the simulation gave me a result I was happy with. Next, I created the simulation of the worm's impact with the ground. I used a particle system as the flow object. This can be selected in the flow settings. Here's a quick look at the domain parameters. The background smoke simulation probably took me the longest. In the end, I'm happy with it because it looks somewhat similar to the original scene. At first, I tried using the sandworms as effector objects, so that the smoke would react to their movement, but the simulation didn't behave as expected. No matter what I changed, The smoke didn't respond to the worms. Instead, it followed them. So I decided to try a different approach. Besides a large object emitting background smoke, I also used the sandworms themselves as flow objects. I used vertex groups to define the areas of each worm that should emit smoke, and then I used keyframes to control when the emission would start and stop. This approach finally gave me a result that looked close to the original scene. After finishing all the simulations, I imported them into one Blender file. There, I adjusted the textures of each simulation. You can now see a quick look at how the OpenVDB files were imported. This is how the final scene looked in the viewport. Then, it was time to start rendering. At first, I tried to render everything at once, but that didn't go very well. The idea of waiting half a day for one frame was terrifying. So, I changed my strategy. I rendered each part of the scene as a separate layer, and later combined everything in the compositor. This way, I could adjust the render settings for each layer, and optimize the entire process. I enabled the holdout option for objects that weren't supposed to be rendered in a given layer. I ended up with quite a lot of layers. Looking back, I think I could have managed it with fewer. The composition started with alpha over nodes to merge the layers. Then, I added other nodes to match the colors between layers more precisely. At the end, I applied lens distortion to simulate the camera, and added some glare to enhance the cinematic look. Here's the full node setup. The final animation turned out the way I hoped. I knew I wouldn't recreate the original scene perfectly, but I wanted to capture it smooth. The process wasn't smooth, the simulations took the most time. In some cases, I had to bake the domain many times before getting a good result. But overall, I'm happy with how it turned out. This project showed me how powerful Blender is, but it also taught me how much patience you need when working with simulations. Changing settings, waiting for bakes, and doing it all over again can be frustrating, but it also feels great when everything finally works. In the original scene, there are people running from the sandworms. I didn't include them in my version. I wanted to keep things simple and focus on the environment and smoke effects. Adding people would have made the project much harder, even if it's not exactly like the original. I think I got close to its feel, and I learned a lot along the way. Here's the final result.